J. Frank Norris got away with murder. Literally. I'm not saying that figuratively. J. Frank Norris killed a man in the office of his church and got away with it. Okay. And again, if you go back and you look at what was going on at that point historically, there's not really a good case to be made that he was innocent, right? This was straight up murder. And so when you have these sort of mega personalities that everything begins to revolve around, and then these mega personalities produce schools. So you have Bob Jones producing Bob Jones University. You have Jack Hyles producing Jack Hyles University. Right? Or you could go to Pensacola Christian College. Wherever you look, you have these mega personalities. And one of the things that appears anytime that happens, whether it's in fundamentalism or outside of fundamentalism, when that sort of obsession around a central personality appears, a almost inevitable result is that whatever quirks exist in that guy's personality or in the way that that guy preaches or in the way that he pastors his particular church are going to become amplified to a greater and greater extent in each successive generation that he produces. And so like quirky things, here's a great example. So some quirks that were only slightly apparent in Mark Driscoll's theology and practice explode 10 years later. And then we see guys that were really deeply influenced by Mark Driscoll that are now even more heavy-handed than he was.
Right.
And so one of the wisest things that I ever had any professor tell me was that, if you take a snapshot of your church as a minister 5 to 7 years in to your time there as the pastor, whatever is wrong with your church is what's wrong with you. Because by 5 to 7 years, you have so influenced that group of people that the flaws in your character and in your personality and in your theology are going to start to appear in your own church. And so what you have in fundamentalism is that writ large.
Yeah.
And so can we call this a movement? Absolutely.
Right.
Because, whether we want to admit it or not within fundamentalism, you're tracing your history back to the same men.
Right.
And their idiosyncrasies are showing up in the next generation. And then their own idiosyncrasies
Or doubling
being
down.
added to that.
Right. Yeah.
And then that's amplified. And then it just continues and continues and continues. The problem, though, downstream is the question of how do you measure influence in a movement that is as fractured as fundamentalism is? Because at this point, it's so fractured that if you went to Johnny Smith in Boone, North Carolina, and said, so I've listened to 700 of your sermons, and these are the influences that I hear in your preaching, there's a really good chance that he's going to look at you cross-eyed. Because if you have the ability to identify those influences, tracing them back beyond 50 years, you're going to start dropping names that this man's never heard of.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the central issues that I have remained stuck on as I've listened to your podcast particularly, and as I've talked with some folks that I know that are more recently out of fundamentalism and some that have been out of fundamentalism for 20 years. I don't know how to accurately measure influence in that environment. So, Hyles. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's a bizarre. It is a bizarre thing to try to figure out. I mean, and it's one of those things where, like, if you told me to sit down on paper and write out the tenets, like I could write out some things, and like people have. I mean, even people have tried to write out. But again, when you're trying to say what percentage of, because Jack Hyles seeped into all of these places. There is some part of him in all of these different churches and schools. But even the ones that say he's not, he's there. But again, it's hard to be like, what percentage of Lancaster Baptist Church in Lancaster, California is Jack Hyles in Hammond, Indiana?
Right.
What percentage is Bob Jones University? What percentage is, Jerry Falwell, like Jerry Falwell early on, And so when you look at all this stuff, like there's a lot of Billy Sunday stuff that's seeped in, ironic to survivors, and something you probably know on the show. Like I can talk to somebody in Hawaii, in Indiana, in Georgia, and they all have the same type of leadership, the same type of theology that they believe, the same, we could all sit down, like I could walk in a church and identify in the first 10 minutes, like, oh, this is an IFB church. But if you said to like, hey, I'm a complete stranger to the movement, can you just write it out so I can know if I want it? It would be kind of tricky in some ways. In some ways it would be very simple, but in other ways it would be very tricky because they are such a weird, like, there's these very weird, like you said, idiosyncrasies. Like there's these very weird things that may not be in some of these churches that are in others, even though they share common tenets overall. But I think what you did, and you mentioned this when we did the podcast on your show, is a lot of it is Bible college. And within, and I think that's kind of the crux of like how you can see the movement spread out, is you can look at what college they came from and it instantly makes sense. Like a Pensacola guy and a West Coast guy look very different, even though they share a lot of things. And Pensacola is really, I think, intentionally moved itself away from a lot of the fundamentalist craziness. I don't know why that, I don't know if it's like a financial reason that they're doing that or if it's what the reason is, but Pensacola's moved, Bob Jones is starting to pull itself into more of the John MacArthur camp, I think a little harder. Like they're trying to lean more into the Reformed kind of, they're trying to tip their toe into the Reformed world anyway.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff there just in and of itself. So like Jack Hyles had and has almost zero influence at Bob Jones University.
Well, I think they would look at him as anti-intellectual. I think they would look at him as,
Right. And Hyles considered Bob Jones to be leftist and compromised.
Which is so funny when you look at Bob Jones, right?
And then Tennessee Temple, which is now closed, but was at one time here in Chattanooga where I'm at. So Tennessee Temple University was too Arminian for Bob Jones University.
Yeah.
But Bob Jones University has also had Calvinist purges where Calvinist professors were run out of the institution. And then you had Pensacola Christian College, which hated Bob Jones for its liberal stance on the text of Scripture because they were non-King James only. And Pensacola accused Bob Jones University, I kid you not, this is my favorite quote in history, of modernistic old Princetonianism, right? And it's like, I'm surprised, to be perfectly frank, that you could string those words together in a sentence.
Right.
Because that is, like, those two things don't belong together. Modernism and old Princeton couldn't be more different.
Right.
And so there are a lot of those pieces. And then like Jerry Falwell and Jack Hyles. Well, if you want to draw the connection between Jerry Falwell and Jack Hyles, where do you go to do that? Because you can't do it within their own lives. You'd have to go at least a generation back.
But it is there.
Yeah, it is there. So does that come in because, and again, this is a legitimate question. I don't know the answer to this. One of Falwell's biggest mentors was a guy named George Beauchamp Vick. And so was Vick influenced by Hyles? I don't know. He possibly was. G.B. Vick was, I can't think of the guy's name, but he was really closely related to one of J. Frank Norris's successors.
Not John R. Rice, no?
No, not John R. Rice. John R. Rice is the sword of the Lord end of fundamentalism.
But Rice did have a connection to Norris, though.
Yes, but in fairness,
proving
I think that
this is the difficulty. But this is the thing where I think what I'm seeing, and I think I'm seeing it now being out, but I'm seeing guys who are in the world, and I'm just curious if you agree with this. And we've hit on like the biggest, Achilles heel problem within the independent circles is that lack of accountability and structure, where there is no ability to. What I'm seeing, and you may disagree, but what I see is a lot of individuals trying to do their own reformation by themselves and trying to pull this, and basically just take the good things they liked and then run and start. So you'll see a Hyles guy and a Pensacola guy be like, I hated this about my college. I hate this about my college. yeah, well, we hate the same thing. Let's start a place. And it starts this very convoluted kind of ministry. You know, like my church growing up, there were guys who were West Coast who were very hardcore on some things. There were guys that were Pensacola that were very hardcore on other things. There were guys from, our pastor was from Hiles, which, considering he's from Hiles, is like a really nice guy, which is like, I'm always like, well, at least got the easiest version of that we could have gotten. But again, it was all these guys, and they all had problems with the prior places, but they also still had some of the weird things. But our church growing up doesn't look like, I can't look at our church and be like, that looks like a Hiles church, or it looks like a West Coast knockoff, or it looks like a Pensacola. It was its own weird thing that had weird characteristics from all of them.